I support the schools. My son's in the school, but I have a question for, I don't know if the school committee or the superintendent or the business manager. There's been a lot of work done on various buildings in the school department, and I'd like to know just how much money of the budget from last year that we added $330,000 to was spent on asbestos removal at the bat shelter, any other renovation that was done on any of the buildings. Because the way I understood is that this money was supposed to be for teachers. I don't really see how this building renovation does the education system any good.
Mr. Suarez?
Mrs. Bodell, first on your question. The $330,000, as we've said before, went to the following items. 2.5 new positions, a full-time guidance teacher at the middle school, a full-time English teacher at the high school, and a half-time kindergarten. That was $85,000. 4 new aide positions, 1 special education, 1 high school media center aide, and 2 elementary aides. That's $45,000. The additional 4 aides versus teachers were forced because of the timeliness or lack of timeliness of the approved budget. We had to wait until October before we knew how much money we had to spend. At that point, aides were less disruptive in the classroom. We hired more aides than we originally hoped to and fewer teachers than we hoped to. We added a custodian at $19,000. We added a sum to fund the contractual obligations from the previous contracts. These are step increases in the teachers' contracts and everyone else's contract for a total of $62,000. Some to fund the negotiated longevity increases of the past year. These were the longevity increases that we granted the teachers late in the school year, this past school year, to bring them up closer to the level of the police and the firemen in trade, if you will, for their willingness to accept a 0 increase in this year's salary negotiations. That cost us $65,000. On extracurricular salaries for $15,000, and this was brought about because, if you remember, we tried to institute an activities fee last year, and that was rejected by the Attorney General. We weren't allowed to do it. We couldn't collect the money anyway, and we couldn't force anybody to provide those funds. So we had to fund it by adding $15,000. That was a total of $291,000, pretty much as we stood here last year at town meeting and said we were going to spend the $330,000. The additional $40,000 went to computers and printers for $20,000, and textbooks, testing, and supplies for $20,000. There is the $330,000, and we have given that detail out ever since we've had it, which is right after the negotiations closed about 2 months ago. So these numbers were, I'm not sure whether it was at the public hearing in March or soon after that, but these numbers have been public and have been released. They were requested earlier by the Taxpayers Association, and as soon as they became available after negotiations closed, we provided them to the Taxpayers Association. So these are not hidden numbers. These are not hidden factories. These are public numbers that we're proud to say that we're pretty close to what we said they were going to be a year ago. That brings me to a couple of additional points I'd like to make. The first regarding Mr. Pasquale's presentation. I, as the rest of the school committee members did, voted to allow Mr. Pasquale the time to speak to town meeting. I hoped we would hear something constructive. We usually do when John comes to our meetings. I agree he should be commended for his conscientiousness. Unfortunately, however, I was disappointed in what I heard. There was nothing new here. There was a lot of confusion. Some of his numbers were wrong. Some of his numbers were inappropriate. I encourage you to look hard before you make a decision on how to vote regarding Mr. Pasquale's amendment. I think his figures are well-meaning, but for the most part, in error. Second point regarding the $70,000 request that's in the line item for negotiations. I ask you to consider yourself at a negotiating table. If you were able to say, well, we can give you anything you want because it has to go to town meeting, you are in essence taking away the incentive to the elected board, for the elected board, to go into those negotiating sessions and being able to say, this is all we have. We can squeeze a little bit out of here, we can squeeze a little bit out of there. But in essence, what we're doing is what I hoped for years that the school committee would have done, which is to tell you what our ceiling is. We are allotting $70,000, which is not much more than 1% of the salary budget, for teacher salaries, for salaries. Now, if we find ourselves in a position that we have to go over that, and we determine that that's a good idea to do for the morale of the system or for additional teachers or for whatever, then we're going to have to find that in the budget that you give us tonight. But the $70,000 figure is much better to go into the negotiations with as a ceiling, as a town meeting prescribed ceiling, than going in with zero and being able to say to the other side, anything you want, we can go back to town meeting and let them shoot it down. It just breaks down the level of trust that exists in a negotiating session. The third item that I think you have to keep in mind is the concept of, I did answer your question, of the $330,000 not, that's a different question. You asked how much money of the, you said we were in here for the $330,000 last year. How much of it was spent on the renovation? None of it. I don't have that figure. We'll have to turn this over to Mr. Young for the specific figure of how much was spent on renovation. The line item for renovation is in the facilities and grounds budget, facilities and maintenance budget. The concept of per pupil cost. If you go back several years, you'll hit the number of $4,300. That's what we were spending in 1989 for per pupil cost. We are embarking on an era now where for the next several years, for as long as we can project, we're going to have more students in the system each year, 50, 60, 40, whatever. It changes from year to year based on the projections. The point is, if we don't start to recognize that now, if we don't accept that vision of what the system is going to be, we're going to be hit with a bubble in several years from now that we're not going to be able to afford. Or we're going to accept the fact that we're going to spend year after year less on the kids. So what I'm proposing, what the school committee is proposing, is that we recognize the per pupil cost, and we are level funding at per pupil cost, except for the $70,000, and that's an additional $36 per pupil. The total number per pupil is $4,502. Now, that's several $100s below the state average. We don't think it's too much to ask. That's why we're here trying to defend it. I think the basic issue that it comes down to is you've elected us to do our job. I'm very proud of the job that we've done, and I think it comes down to a question of trust. If you think we're putting money somewhere that you don't want it, if you think we're throwing money down the toilet, if you think we're funding positions that are not needed, then you should not support our position. If you don't feel that way, then you should at the very least give us the courtesy of understanding, thoroughly understanding why we believe that the item,
Mr.
the line
Suarez, you
item
have
should be funded
15
this way.
seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Walsh, please state your name and address, sir.
Ray Walsh, 5 Sandiron Way. Unlike a lot of people here, I don't have any children in the school system, but that doesn't mean I don't support the school system. I do it for several reasons. I believe in education. I believe in maintaining a standard in the town so my property level can stay up where it is or get back to what I paid for it, but that's another long discussion. I stood up originally to ask for comments from the school committee on Mr. Pasquale's dissertation. As I heard it, he never ever asked for any reduction for the teachers, for the children, and for everything else that goes to what everybody here says is good education. He focused on overhead. Mr. Suarez stood up and in 30 seconds, he dismissed his 27-odd minute discussion. I thought he had some good points. I remember last year's meeting, and Mr. Suarez says it's old stuff. Last year we wanted to get rid of some of the custodians and get the money down. And I would like to hear something from the school committee, because this, I'm sure, does not come as any surprise to them that he has put up before us what he has. And I, for one, although I would support the school committee to the hilt, if I can't get a good explanation of why they think his $230,000 is wrong, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to vote against you, and I'm going to vote for the stabilization fund to get 2/3 vote. That's not a threat, that's a promise.
Mr. Jervy.
Mr. Pasquale does put in a lot of time, but I'm not particularly grateful to him tonight because he didn't have the intellectual integrity to present these numbers to us in time to review them all. I have sat over here and I have reviewed some of them in the few minutes I've had, and I'd like to go over those with you. First of all, on his list was facilities. He suggested taking $10,000 off of oil and heat. He thought that this winter was so mild that next winter should be budgeted at the same level. This winter we budgeted $115,000, and our present estimate is that we will spend $115,747. Now that's an extrapolation based on the bills in hand to date. But the $115,000 this year is not too much. And for us to assume that next winter will be as mild doesn't make sense to me. As Mr. Pasquale pointed out, this is the mildest winter in a long time. The next item on his list was custodial. He suggested trimming $25,000. He said we had 16 people, even though our report only lists 14.2. Mr. Pasquale also put up a list of administrators where the director of the facilities is listed. That's one of the 1.8 people he was missing. He wanted to double count. The other 8/10 goes for a line we call transportation. We are obliged to provide transportation for special education students. We have found that by providing it in-house, we can save a good deal of money. We have 8/10 of the time of people who would otherwise be doing custodial work, providing this transportation for children in the SEAM program and other special education needs. He suggested we trim $30,000 from aides and tutors, and I will ask you to look with me, if you will, at the item for aides and tutors. You will see under special education aides a dramatic increase. Those of you who have been looking at neighbors without jobs realize that there's a great deal more stress and tension in the environment these days. We are feeling it in the schools. There are more children looking for individual education programs and getting them and needing them. We have to meet that need by law. You will also find a major increase in media. That position is specifically to relieve the high school librarian who is heading the effort to get our high school reaccredited. It's a 10-year renewal process. The high school librarian is leading up that process, and this position is specifically to relieve her time. It is going entirely to the reaccreditation process. The next item on Mr. Pasquale's list, if I got it all, was in office, where he suggested trimming $25,000. And I'm sorry, but I can't pull that apart this quickly. I don't think that we have excessive office staff, because we have to meet requirements that are set for us outside of the schools. We have to do books in one way to meet state requirements and in another way to meet the town's warrant structure. It would be wonderful to streamline that process, but we are at the mercy of other factors. The next item on Mr. Pasquale's list was a relatively small item. It was in the area of teachers' differentials, where he suggested we trim $13,000. And some of those differentials, ladies and gentlemen, are things that are new. We're spending things in areas like computer coordinator. We're doing things in part for the reaccreditation. I can't put numbers on it. This is just another example of where, if we hadn't been blindsided, we could have given you the hard numbers. Administration. He called attention to a discrepancy between his list of salaries and the number in the booklet. He had come up with $557,000 for salaries, and you will note we are asking for $571,000.